You wake up in the dead of night in a magnificent castle, the kind you've seen in fairy tales. Moonlight streams through stained glass windows, casting colorful shadows across stone walls that have witnessed centuries of history. The tapestries are rich with gold thread, the furniture carved from the finest oak, and everywhere you look speaks of wealth beyond imagination. But then it hits you, a desperate, urgent need that no amount of noble breeding can ignore. Your stomach clenches, and you realize you need to relieve yourself immediately. So you stumble through the darkness, searching for what we would today call a bathroom. But here's where your modern expectations collide brutally with medieval reality. There is no bathroom. There's no running water, no toilet paper, no privacy, and certainly no dignity in what you're about to experience. What you find instead is a wooden seat with a hole cut through it, perched precariously over a shaft that drops straight down into a pit of human waste that hasn't been cleaned in months. The smell hits you like a physical blow, so overwhelming that you actually gag. But you have no choice. This is how the wealthiest, most powerful people in medieval Europe dealt with their most basic human needs. Before diving into these forgotten truths about medieval life, if you enjoy learning about the hidden realities of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient mysteries together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared fascination with how people really lived. The truth about medieval bathroom habits isn't just disgusting. It's a window into a world so different from ours that it might as well be an alien planet. We're going to uncover secrets that medieval chroniclers were too embarrassed to record, practices so revolting that modern historians often gloss over them, and hygiene disasters that literally shaped the architecture of castles and the politics of kingdoms. What I'm about to reveal will completely change how you think about medieval nobility. These weren't the refined, elegant aristocrats you see in movies. They were people living in conditions that would horrify a modern prisoner, yet they convinced themselves, and history, that they were the pinnacle of civilization. The story begins with the garderobe, a French word that literally means to guard the robe. But this wasn't a closet for storing clothes. The garderobe was medieval Europe's answer to the toilet, and understanding how it worked reveals everything you need to know about medieval priorities, medieval engineering, and medieval attitudes toward basic human dignity. Picture this. You're a wealthy lord living in a massive stone castle in the year 1200. Your home is a fortress designed to withstand sieges, but it's also supposed to be a symbol of your power and refinement. Every room has been carefully planned to demonstrate your wealth and status. The great hall where you feast your guests is magnificent, with soaring ceilings and elaborate decorations. Your private chambers are furnished with the finest textiles and crafted furniture that took master artisans months to complete. But when nature calls, you walk to a small chamber built directly into the castle's outer wall. This room contains nothing but a wooden bench with a circular hole cut through it. Below that hole is a vertical shaft that plunges straight down through the thickness of the castle wall and opens directly to the outside world. There's no plumbing, no water to flush anything away, no mechanism to contain or process waste. Everything simply falls through that hole and drops dozens of feet down to accumulate in a pile at the base of your castle wall. Now imagine you're not the only person using this system. Your wife uses it, your children use it, your guests use it, and sometimes even your servants when the other facilities are occupied. Multiple people might visit the same hole several times a day, and everything they deposit joins the growing mountain of human waste directly beneath your home's walls. The smell rising from these waste piles was so intense that it could be detected from miles away. Travelers approaching a castle would often smell it long before they could see the structure itself. The stench would cling to everything, your clothes, your hair, your skin. It would seep into the stone walls and wooden furniture, creating a permanent odor that no amount of perfume or incense could mask. But here's what makes this even more disturbing. Medieval nobles didn't see this as a problem to be solved. They saw it as perfectly normal, even sophisticated. The garderobe was considered an advancement over simply squatting in the woods or using chamber pots that had to be emptied by servants. Having a dedicated waste disposal system built into your castle walls was actually a status symbol, proof that you could afford such luxuries. The construction of these garderobes reveals medieval priorities in ways that are both fascinating and horrifying. Castle architects would carefully plan the placement of these waste chutes, but their concerns weren't about hygiene or comfort, they were about military defense and social hierarchy. Garderobes were typically built into the outer walls because it was easier to construct the vertical shafts, and because having waste fall outside the castle meant it wouldn't accumulate in the inner courtyard where important activities took place. But this created its own problems. Enemy armies besieging a castle would often camp directly beneath these walls, meaning they would be constantly bombarded by falling human waste. Some military historians argue that this was actually intentional, that the placement of garderobes was a defensive strategy designed to make life miserable for besieging forces. Whether this was planned or just a fortunate side effect, the result was the same. Medieval warfare literally involved fighting while being pelted with human excrement. The social hierarchy of garderobe usage reveals even more about medieval attitudes. The lord and lady of the castle would have their own private garderobe, usually located conveniently near their sleeping chambers. But this wasn't a modern private bathroom. It was still just a hole in the wall, and the waste still fell to the same pile as everyone else's. The difference was simply that nobles didn't have to share their particular hole with anyone of lower social status. Lesser nobles and important guests might have access to a second garderobe, perhaps located in a different part of the castle, but operating on the same basic principle. Servants and common soldiers would typically share communal facilities that were even more basic, often nothing more than a long wooden bench with multiple holes cut into it, allowing several people to relieve themselves simultaneously with no privacy whatsoever. The waste that accumulated at the base of castle walls created problems that went far beyond mere disgust. These piles would attract enormous swarms of flies and other insects that would then invade the castle itself. The decomposing waste would contaminate local water sources, leading to outbreaks of dysentery and other diseases that could kill dozens of people. During rainy seasons, the waste would become a liquid soup that would flow across the surrounding landscape, making the entire area around major castles essentially uninhabitable. Yet medieval people had developed elaborate systems for dealing with these consequences that reveal their twisted priorities. Rather than improving their waste disposal methods, they focused on managing the side effects. Wealthy nobles would employ servants whose job was to burn incense and scatter flower petals throughout the castle to mask odors. They would import expensive perfumes and oils to scent their clothing and bodies. They would even hire musicians to play loudly during meals to distract from the sounds and smells wafting up from the waste piles below. Some castles employed gong farmers, specialized workers whose job was to periodically clean out the accumulated waste from the base of garderobe shafts. This was considered one of the most degrading jobs in medieval society, and gong farmers were social outcasts who lived on the margins of communities. They worked only at night, partly because the smell was supposedly less intense in cooler air, but mainly because decent people didn't want to see them or be reminded of what they were doing. The tools and techniques used by gong farmers were as primitive as everything else about medieval waste management. They would use long-handled shovels and buckets to scoop up the accumulated human waste, then cart it away to dump in fields or rivers. Sometimes they would sell it to farmers as fertilizer, but more often they would simply dispose of it wherever was most convenient, spreading disease and contamination throughout the surrounding countryside. The health consequences of these medieval bathroom practices were catastrophic in ways that people at the time barely understood. Without any knowledge of germs or disease transmission, medieval people couldn't comprehend why certain areas had higher rates of illness and death. They attributed disease outbreaks to divine punishment, bad air, or astrological influences, never making the connection between their waste disposal methods and the epidemics that regularly swept through their communities. Dysentery was so common in medieval castles that it was considered a normal part of life rather than a preventable disease. Historical records show that entire noble families would be wiped out by what they called the bloody flux, violent diarrhea that could kill within days. Modern medical knowledge tells us this was typically caused by bacterial contamination from human waste, but medieval people saw it as an unavoidable fate that could strike anyone at any time. The situation became even more complex during times of siege when castles would be sealed off from the outside world for months at a time. The normal waste disposal system would continue operating, but there would be no opportunity for gong farmers to clean out the accumulated refuse. The piles of human waste would grow higher and higher, eventually reaching the point where they would actually pile up inside the garderobe chambers themselves. Castle defenders during long sieges would sometimes find themselves literally wading through human excrement to reach their waste disposal facilities. The smell would become so overwhelming that people would prefer to soil themselves rather than enter the garderobe chambers. Some historical accounts describe siege situations where the defenders were eventually forced to surrender, not because they ran out of food or weapons, but because the accumulation of waste had made their castle uninhabitable. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of medieval bathroom practices was how they affected the most vulnerable members of society, particularly children and pregnant women. Young children who were more susceptible to disease and less able to cope with the physical challenges of using garderobes suffered disproportionately from the health consequences of poor sanitation. Pregnant women faced additional risks, as the stress of climbing stairs and positioning themselves over garderobe holes could trigger complications or miscarriages. Medieval medical texts, written by the most educated people of their time, reveal an almost complete ignorance of the connection between waste and disease. Physicians would recommend treatments for dysentery that involved consuming various herbs and minerals, but they never suggested improving sanitation as a preventive measure. Some medical authorities actually believed that the smell of human waste had healing properties, recommending that sick people spend time near garderobe chambers to inhale the beneficial vapors. The clothing worn by medieval nobles was specifically designed to accommodate their primitive bathroom facilities, though this practical consideration was disguised behind elaborate fashion statements. The long, flowing robes favored by wealthy men and women weren't just symbols of status. They were necessary for maintaining some semblance of modesty while using garderobes that offered no privacy. Women's clothing presented particular challenges, as the multiple layers of heavy fabric made garderobe use a complex and time-consuming process. Getting dressed and undressed required assistance from servants, which meant that using bathroom facilities became a semi-public activity involving multiple people. The lack of underwear in medieval times wasn't a matter of comfort or fashion. It was a practical necessity for people who needed to quickly access garderobe facilities multiple times per day. The psychological impact of these bathroom conditions on medieval people is something historians rarely discuss, but it must have been profound. Living in constant proximity to human waste, breathing air contaminated with the smell of decomposition, and having no expectation of privacy during the most intimate bodily functions would have shaped medieval attitudes toward cleanliness, dignity, and human worth in ways we can barely imagine. Yet somehow, medieval nobles convinced themselves that their lifestyle represented the height of civilization and refinement. They looked down on peasants who lived in simple huts, never acknowledging that those peasants often had better sanitation than the inhabitants of great castles. They prided themselves on their sophisticated manners and elaborate etiquette, while literally living surrounded by mountains of their own excrement. This disconnect between medieval self-perception and medieval reality becomes even more apparent when we examine how bathroom practices varied across different levels of society. The very poorest people, serfs and landless peasants, often had more hygienic waste disposal methods than their noble masters, simply because they couldn't afford to build permanent structures and were forced to adapt more flexible solutions. Peasant farmers would typically dig simple latrines away from their living spaces and cover the waste with dirt, creating a much more sanitary system than the elaborate garderobe chutes of castles. They understood, through practical necessity, that human waste needed to be kept away from food preparation areas and water sources. But because they were considered ignorant and uncivilized, their superior sanitation methods were dismissed by the nobility as primitive and beneath consideration. The irony becomes even more striking when we look at how medieval people handled animal waste versus human waste. Stable boys who cleaned horse stalls were meticulous about removing manure and keeping the animals clean and healthy. Farmers understood that pig waste needed to be managed carefully to prevent disease in their livestock. Yet these same people who showed sophisticated understanding of animal hygiene lived in conditions that would have killed their horses and pigs within weeks. Medieval nobles would spend fortunes on elaborate tapestries to cover their walls, imported spices to flavor their food, and fine wines to stock their cellars. But they wouldn't invest a single coin in improving their waste disposal systems. A lord might own goblets made of gold and silver, but he would still relieve himself over a hole that hadn't been cleaned in months. The disconnect between their material wealth and their living conditions reveals a mindset so alien to modern thinking that it's almost impossible to comprehend. The architectural evidence of these priorities can still be seen in surviving medieval castles across Europe. If you visit these ruins today, you can often identify the garderobe chambers by the distinctive shafts built into the walls. What's remarkable is how these facilities were integrated into the overall design of the castle. They weren't hidden away as shameful necessities, they were built prominently into the main living areas, sometimes directly adjacent to the Great Hall where nobles would entertain important guests. Imagine hosting a formal dinner in your Great Hall, with visiting dignitaries and important allies seated at your table, while the sound and smell of people using the garderobe just through the wall provided a constant background to your political negotiations. Medieval people had become so accustomed to these conditions that they literally couldn't smell or hear what would be overwhelming to modern senses. The seasonal variations in medieval bathroom experiences add another layer of horror to this story. During winter months, when temperatures would drop below freezing, the waste in garderobe shafts would sometimes freeze solid, creating blockages that would force waste to back up into the chambers themselves. Castle inhabitants would wake up to find their bathroom facilities filled with frozen human excrement that couldn't be removed until spring thaw. Summer brought different but equally revolting challenges. The heat would accelerate decomposition, creating even more intense odors and attracting swarms of insects that would make garderobe chambers virtually unusable during daylight hours. Some castles developed systems of hanging cloths soaked in vinegar or wine around garderobe entrances, attempting to create barriers against the flies and wasps that would swarm around the waste shafts. The social etiquette surrounding garderobe use reveals medieval attitudes toward privacy and dignity that are completely foreign to modern sensibilities. It was considered normal for multiple family members to use the same garderobe chamber simultaneously, with no expectation of privacy or personal space. Fathers and sons, mothers and daughters, even unrelated guests would share these facilities without any sense that this might be inappropriate or uncomfortable. Conversation during garderobe use was not only acceptable but expected. Important business discussions, family planning, and social gossip would continue uninterrupted while people relieved themselves. Some historians have found evidence that certain political negotiations and business deals were actually conducted in garderobe chambers, perhaps because the informal setting made people more willing to speak honestly about sensitive topics. The children born into these conditions faced challenges that go beyond anything we can imagine today. Toilet training in medieval times didn't involve teaching children to use modern facilities. It involved teaching them to balance precariously over holes while wearing heavy clothing, often in complete darkness. Many children fell into garderobe shafts and had to be rescued if they survived the fall. Some castle records mention children who simply disappeared, presumably having fallen into waste chutes and never been found. Pregnant women faced particular dangers from garderobe use, as their changing bodies made it increasingly difficult to position themselves safely over the holes. Miscarriages attributed to falls or strains related to garderobe use appear regularly in medieval medical records, though the connection between poor sanitation facilities and reproductive health was never understood by medieval physicians. The clothing damage caused by regular garderobe use was another hidden cost of medieval bathroom practices. The expensive fabrics favored by nobles would quickly become stained and damaged from contact with waste-contaminated surfaces. Elaborate gowns and robes that represented enormous investments of time and money would be ruined within months of regular use. This created a constant need for new clothing that contributed to the financial pressures faced by noble families trying to maintain their status. Medieval people developed elaborate rituals around cleaning themselves after garderobe use, But these practices revealed their fundamental misunderstanding of hygiene and disease prevention. Instead of water and soap, they would use materials like straw, leaves, or pieces of cloth that would often be reused multiple times before being discarded. Wealthy nobles might use pieces of linen or silk for this purpose, but even these luxury materials would be saved and washed for repeated use. The concept of toilet paper wouldn't be invented for centuries, leaving medieval people to improvise with whatever materials were available. Some used moss or other soft plant materials. Others relied on smooth stones or pieces of pottery. The wealthiest nobles might have access to specially prepared cloths, but even these were far from the disposable hygiene products we take for granted today. The water sources in medieval castles were frequently contaminated by waste from garderobe systems, creating cycles of disease that people couldn't understand or prevent. Wells and cisterns built too close to waste disposal areas would become poisoned with bacteria, causing outbreaks of illness that would be attributed to everything except the obvious source. Castle inhabitants would drink contaminated water daily, never making the connection between their bathroom practices and their constant health problems. Some castles attempted to address waste management through primitive drainage systems, but these often made the problems worse rather than better. Channels cut into stone floors to direct waste away from living areas would become clogged with refuse, creating stagnant pools of contaminated water throughout the castle. These drainage systems, designed to improve sanitation, actually became breeding grounds for disease-carrying insects and sources of even more intense odors. The international diplomatic implications of medieval bathroom practices created awkward situations that shaped political relationships between kingdoms. Foreign ambassadors visiting medieval courts would often become violently ill from exposure to unfamiliar waste-related diseases, leading to diplomatic incidents and strained relationships between allied nations. Some historical accounts suggest that certain political alliances failed, partly because visiting dignitaries couldn't tolerate the sanitary conditions in their hosts' castles. Medieval people's attitudes toward cleanliness were so different from modern standards that they literally couldn't perceive dirt and contamination that would be obvious to us. They had become so accustomed to living with human waste that they developed a kind of sensory blindness to conditions that would horrify anyone from the modern world. This wasn't ignorance, it was adaptation to circumstances they saw as unchangeable and normal. The religious implications of medieval bathroom practices created theological debates that seem absurd today, but were serious concerns at the time. Church authorities debated whether certain natural bodily functions were sinful, whether cleanliness was a virtue or a vanity, and whether suffering from poor sanitation was a form of penance that brought believers closer to God. Some religious orders actually forbade their members from cleaning themselves too thoroughly, viewing excessive concern with hygiene as a sign of worldly pride. The economic impact of medieval waste management, or the lack thereof, extended far beyond the costs of building and maintaining garderobe systems. The constant health problems caused by poor sanitation reduced productivity, shortened lifespans, and created ongoing medical expenses that drained family resources. Entire regions around major castles became economically depressed because the contamination from waste disposal made agriculture difficult and drove away potential settlers and merchants. Yet through all of this horror, medieval nobles maintained their conviction that they represented the pinnacle of human civilization and refinement. They wrote poetry about courtly love while their castles reeked of human excrement. They composed elaborate rules of chivalry while wading through pools of their own waste. They looked down upon merchants and craftsmen as socially inferior, never recognizing that these supposedly lower-class people often lived in cleaner, healthier conditions than the inhabitants of the greatest palaces in Europe. The marriage customs of medieval nobility were directly shaped by their bathroom realities in ways that reveal the true horror of their daily existence. When noble families arranged marriages between their children, one of the unspoken considerations was whether the bride would be able to adapt to the sanitation conditions of her new home. Young women who had grown up in one castle's particular waste management system would sometimes become violently ill when exposed to the different bacterial environment of their husband's family castle. Wedding celebrations in medieval castles took place literally surrounded by the smell and presence of human waste. Yet these were considered the most elegant and sophisticated social events of the age. Guests would arrive wearing their finest clothing, bringing expensive gifts, and participating in elaborate ceremonies while breathing air, thick with the stench of decomposing human refuse. The contrast between the pageantry and the reality was so stark that it seems like something from a fever dream. The honeymoon period for newlywed nobles often involved the bride learning to navigate her new home's garderobe system, which could be significantly different from what she had grown up with. Some castles had garderobes that required climbing narrow spiral staircases in heavy gowns, while others involved walking through outdoor courtyards in all-weather conditions. These practical considerations of waste disposal became part of the adjustment period that determined whether a marriage would be happy or miserable. Childbirth in medieval castles presented unique challenges related to waste management that modern people can barely comprehend. Pregnant women in labor would sometimes be unable to reach garderobe facilities, leading to situations where human waste became mixed with the already unsanitary conditions of medieval delivery rooms. The infection rates and mortality statistics for both mothers and babies become much more understandable when you realize they were giving birth in environments contaminated with human excrement. The education of noble children included lessons in proper garderobe etiquette that were considered as important as learning to read or ride horses. Young lords and ladies would be taught the correct posture for using waste facilities, how to arrange their clothing to minimize contact with contaminated surfaces, and the social protocols for sharing garderobe chambers with family members and guests. These skills were seen as essential markers of aristocratic breeding and refinement. Medieval physicians developed elaborate theories about the health benefits of different waste-related practices, creating medical advice that seems insane by modern standards. Some doctors recommended that patients spend time breathing the vapors from garderobe chambers to cure respiratory ailments. Others prescribed drinking small amounts of diluted human waste as a treatment for digestive problems. These weren't the recommendations of ignorant quacks. They were the considered opinions of the most educated medical authorities of their time. The seasonal migration patterns of medieval noble families were often determined by the state of their various castles' waste disposal systems. When the accumulation of refuse at one location became unbearable even by medieval standards, the entire household would pack up and move to another castle, leaving behind servants to deal with the cleanup. This wasn't seen as a sanitation measure, it was simply how wealthy families managed their multiple properties throughout the year. The construction industry in medieval Europe developed specialized expertise in building garderobe systems, with master craftsmen who were renowned for their skill in creating efficient waste disposal chutes. These artisans were highly valued and well paid, despite working on what we would consider the most disgusting aspect of castle construction. They developed sophisticated techniques for calculating the proper angles and dimensions for waste shafts, ensuring that refuse would fall cleanly without backing up into the chambers above. The military strategies of medieval warfare were significantly influenced by the waste disposal systems of castles under siege. Attacking armies would often try to block garderobe outlets to force waste to back up into the castle, making life unbearable for the defenders. Some sieges were won not through starvation or assault, but by creating sanitary conditions so horrible that the defenders preferred surrender to continuing their resistance. Diplomatic immunity in medieval times included protection from having to use unfamiliar garderobe systems, as foreign ambassadors often requested permission to bring their own portable waste disposal equipment when visiting other courts. These diplomatic pouches would include specially designed chamber pots and cleaning materials that would allow visiting dignitaries to avoid exposure to their hosts' sanitation systems. Such requests were considered reasonable and necessary for maintaining international relations. The inheritance laws of medieval nobility included detailed provisions for the maintenance and cleaning of garderobe systems, recognizing that these facilities were essential infrastructure that needed to be properly managed. Estate documents would specify which servants were responsible for waste removal, how often cleaning should be performed, and what materials could be used for these purposes. The failure to maintain proper waste disposal could actually be grounds for legal action between family members fighting over property rights. The guild system that governed medieval crafts included specialized organizations for waste management workers, with their own rules, traditions, and protective regulations. Gong farmers and garderobe cleaners had their own professional associations that negotiated wages, working conditions, and safety standards for these dangerous occupations. These guilds were necessary because the work was so hazardous and socially stigmatized that workers needed collective bargaining power to survive economically. The religious calendar of medieval Christianity was actually influenced by the practical realities of waste management, with certain cleaning activities scheduled around holy days and seasonal celebrations. The spring cleaning that became traditional in European cultures originally included the annual clearing of accumulated waste from garderobe systems, timed to coincide with Easter and the renewal symbolism of the resurrection. These practical necessities became wrapped in religious meaning and cultural tradition. The artistic and literary works produced in medieval castles were created in environments saturated with the smell and presence of human waste, yet they managed to achieve beauty and sophistication that still moves us today. Illuminated manuscripts were painted in scriptoriums where the air was thick with garderobe vapors. Epic poems were composed in great halls, where the background soundtrack included the sounds of people relieving themselves just through the walls. The human capacity to create transcendent art despite revolting conditions reveals something profound about the resilience of the creative spirit. The fashion trends of medieval nobility were directly shaped by the practical requirements of garderobe use, though these influences were disguised as aesthetic choices. The popularity of certain colors was determined partly by their ability to hide stains from waste-related accidents. The preference for heavily perfumed fabrics wasn't just about luxury, it was a necessity for masking odors that would cling to clothing after garderobe visits. The elaborate headwear favored by noble women served partly to protect their hair from contamination in poorly ventilated waste facilities. The entertainment culture of medieval courts developed around the need to distract from the constant presence of waste-related discomfort. Elaborate musical performances, theatrical presentations, and storytelling traditions served partly to mask the sounds and smells that were inescapable parts of castle life. The famous tradition of courtly romance, with its emphasis on idealized love and spiritual purity, can be understood as a psychological escape from the physical reality of living surrounded by human excrement. The international trade networks of medieval Europe included specialized markets for waste management supplies and equipment. Merchants would travel between kingdoms selling improved garderobe construction materials, cleaning tools, and aromatic substances designed to make waste disposal more tolerable. These traders were essential for spreading innovations in sanitation technology, though the improvements they offered were minimal by modern standards. The diplomatic protocols of medieval courts included elaborate etiquette surrounding garderobe use during state visits and international negotiations. Foreign dignitaries would be assigned specific waste facilities based on their rank and importance, with the most honored guests receiving access to the cleanest and most private garderobe chambers available. These assignments were serious matters of international diplomacy that could affect relationships between kingdoms for years to come. The economic accounting systems of medieval estates included detailed records of waste management expenses, revealing the true cost of these primitive sanitation systems. Castle administrators would track spending on garderobe construction, cleaning supplies, servant wages for waste removal, and medical treatments for diseases caused by poor sanitation. These records show that waste management consumed a significant portion of noble household budgets, though it was rarely discussed openly in polite society. The technological innovations of medieval Europe were often driven by desperate attempts to improve waste disposal systems, though most of these efforts failed to achieve meaningful progress. Inventors would propose elaborate mechanical systems for moving waste away from living areas, complex chemical treatments for reducing odors, and architectural modifications designed to improve ventilation in garderobe chambers. The failure of these innovations wasn't due to lack of trying, it was because medieval people fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the problems they were trying to solve. The social mobility patterns of medieval society were influenced by people's willingness and ability to tolerate different levels of waste-related discomfort. Servants who could work in the most contaminated environments without becoming ill were more valuable and could command higher wages. Nobles who were particularly sensitive to odors or prone to waste-related diseases might find their social status declining as they became unable to participate fully in court life. The legal systems of medieval Europe included specific laws governing waste disposal, though these regulations were often ignored or unenforced. Municipal codes would specify where human waste could be dumped, what materials could be used for cleaning, and who was responsible for maintaining public sanitation. The gap between these written laws and actual practice reveals the enormous challenge of governing societies that lack the basic infrastructure necessary for civilized waste management. The religious pilgrimage traditions of medieval Christianity were partly motivated by the desire to escape the waste-contaminated environments of permanent settlements. Pilgrims would travel for months through the countryside, sleeping outdoors and using simple latrine systems that were often more sanitary than the elaborate garderobe facilities of great castles. The spiritual purification promised by pilgrimage included a very literal cleansing from the physical contamination of normal medieval life. The manuscript traditions that preserved medieval knowledge were threatened by the waste-contaminated environments where books were stored and copied. Parchment and paper would absorb odors and moisture from nearby garderobe systems, causing documents to deteriorate rapidly. Many important historical records were lost not to wars or fires, but to the simple fact that they couldn't survive long-term storage in buildings where human waste was constantly present in the air and water systems. The architectural legacy of medieval waste disposal can still be traced in the design of European cities and buildings constructed centuries later. The placement of certain streets, the orientation of major buildings, and the location of water sources were all influenced by the need to avoid areas that had been contaminated by medieval garderobe systems. Modern urban planners still deal with soil contamination and groundwater pollution that originated from waste disposal practices that ended hundreds of years ago. The psychological adaptation mechanisms that allowed medieval people to function in these conditions reveal the remarkable flexibility of human consciousness. People who lived surrounded by human waste developed the ability to mentally block out smells, sounds, and sights that would overwhelm modern sensibilities. This wasn't just getting used to bad conditions, it was a fundamental rewiring of sensory perception that allowed them to function normally in environments that would be literally uninhabitable for people today. The cultural memory of these practices was systematically erased from historical records as later generations became embarrassed by their ancestors' living conditions. Chronicle writers would focus on military victories, political intrigues, and religious developments while carefully avoiding detailed descriptions of daily life that might reveal the true horror of medieval sanitation. This selective amnesia has left us with a romanticized vision of medieval nobility that bears little resemblance to the reality of their waste-soaked existence. The technological transition away from medieval waste disposal systems happened gradually over several centuries, with different regions and social classes adopting improvements at different rates. The wealthy were often the last to change their practices, partly because they had invested so heavily in existing garderobe infrastructure, and partly because they saw their traditional methods as symbols of aristocratic status that shouldn't be abandoned lightly. The international health consequences of medieval waste practices extended far beyond individual castles and communities. Trade routes became vectors for the spread of waste-related diseases as merchants and travelers carried infections between regions with different bacterial environments. Diplomatic missions often resulted in disease outbreaks as foreign visitors brought unfamiliar pathogens to new areas or contracted local illnesses from exposure to different waste management systems. The medical understanding of these international disease patterns was virtually non-existent, leaving medieval people helpless against epidemics that modern science can trace directly to their waste disposal practices. When plague swept through European courts, killing nobles and commoners alike, physicians would blame everything from planetary alignments to divine wrath, never considering that the answer might be found in the mountains of human excrement surrounding every major castle and city. The marriage alliances that shaped European politics were regularly disrupted by what medieval people called castle sickness, the tendency for foreign brides to become violently ill when exposed to their new home's particular bacterial environment. Young princesses who had grown up breathing the specific mix of waste vapors from their father's castle would sometimes die within months of moving to their husband's domain, their immune systems unable to adapt to different strains of contamination. These deaths were attributed to homesickness, witchcraft, or political poisoning, but the reality was often much simpler. They were dying from exposure to unfamiliar waste-related pathogens. The diplomatic crises that followed these deaths sometimes led to wars between kingdoms, with grieving fathers convinced that their daughters had been murdered when they had actually succumbed to preventable diseases caused by poor sanitation. The servant class that maintained these systems developed their own subculture with its own hierarchy, traditions, and survival strategies. The workers who cleaned garderobe shafts were considered so contaminated that they couldn't enter churches, attend public gatherings, or interact with respectable society. They lived in the separate communities, married only among themselves, and passed their stigmatized profession down through generations like a hereditary curse. Yet these outcasts possessed knowledge that was literally vital to the survival of the medieval civilization. They understood which cleaning methods worked best, how to recognize dangerous buildups of waste that might cause structural damage to castle walls, and when accumulations had reached levels that posed immediate health threats. Their expertise was essential, but their social status was so low that their warnings and recommendations were often ignored by the nobles whose lives depended on their work. The architectural engineering required to support these waste systems was actually quite sophisticated, revealing that medieval builders could solve complex technical problems when they chose to do so. The stone cutting required to create perfectly angled waste chutes, the mathematical calculations needed to ensure proper drainage, and the structural engineering necessary to maintain wall integrity, while cutting large holes through castle foundations, demonstrated impressive technical skill. But this same engineering expertise was never applied to creating better sanitation solutions. Medieval architects could build soaring cathedrals, intricate mechanical clocks, and siege engines of devastating effectiveness, but they couldn't imagine alternatives to simply dropping human waste out of holes in walls. The disconnect between their technical capabilities and their sanitation practices reveals a blind spot so profound that it bordered on willful ignorance. The seasonal rhythms of medieval life were dominated by the practical realities of waste management in ways that shaped everything from agricultural cycles to religious observances. Spring wasn't just about planting crops. It was about cleaning out the winter's accumulation of frozen waste from garderobe systems. Summer brought not just harvest festivals, but the desperate need to manage the intensified odors and insect swarms that made waste areas nearly uninhabitable during hot weather. The cultural celebrations that marked these seasonal transitions often included ritual elements designed to mask or transform the reality of waste cleanup into something more palatable. May Day festivities, with their emphasis on flowers and fresh scents, served partly to psychologically counteract the spring cleaning of garderobe systems. Harvest celebrations were scheduled to coincide with the brief period when waste-related odors were temporarily reduced by the cleaning activities that preceded winter preparations. The economic calculations that governed medieval life included complex cost-benefit analyses of waste management that revealed twisted priorities. A noble family might spend enormous sums on a single feast that would last one evening, while refusing to invest in improvements to waste disposal systems that affected their daily comfort and health for years. They would import exotic spices from distant lands to flavor their food, but wouldn't pay for better materials to construct more sanitary garderobe facilities. These spending decisions weren't based on ignorance of available alternatives. They reflected deep cultural values about what kinds of improvements were worthy of aristocratic attention. Visible displays of wealth and status took priority over invisible improvements to basic living conditions. A tapestry that guests could admire was considered a better investment than a waste disposal system that nobody would talk about publicly. The literary culture of medieval Europe was profoundly shaped by the need to create mental escape from the physical realities of daily life. The romantic ideals celebrated in courtly poetry and chivalric romances can be understood as psychological compensation for living conditions that were the opposite of romantic. Stories of pure love, noble sacrifice, and spiritual transcendence provided emotional refuge from a world where the most basic human functions were sources of constant disgust and discomfort. The gap between literary ideals and lived reality was so extreme that it created a kind of cultural schizophrenia. The same people who spent their days surrounded by human waste would gather in the evenings to listen to stories about knights who embodied perfect purity and ladies whose beauty was unmarred by any earthly contamination. These weren't just entertainment. They were necessary psychological survival mechanisms for people living in conditions that contradicted every human instinct about cleanliness and dignity. The religious interpretations of these conditions reveal medieval Christianity's complex relationship with physical suffering and spiritual purification. Some theologians argued that living in proximity to human waste was a form of penance that brought believers closer to understanding human sinfulness and divine grace. Others suggested that the ability to transcend disgust and discomfort through prayer and meditation was a mark of spiritual advancement. These religious frameworks provided psychological tools for coping with unbearable conditions, but they also prevented people from seeking practical solutions to obvious problems. If living surrounded by human excrement was spiritually beneficial, then improving sanitation might actually be harmful to one's soul. This theological reasoning created intellectual barriers to progress that were often stronger than the technical challenges of developing better waste management systems. The artistic achievements produced in these environments become even more remarkable when we understand the conditions under which they were created. The illuminated manuscripts that represent some of humanity's greatest artistic treasures were painted in scriptoriums, where the air was thick with the smell of human waste. The architectural masterpieces that still inspire awe today were designed and built by people who went home each night to sleep in rooms adjacent to garderobe chambers filled with decomposing excrement. The human capacity to create beauty despite revolting surroundings reveals something profound about the resilience of artistic vision. These medieval artists and craftsmen weren't producing great work because of their living conditions. They were creating transcendent art despite circumstances that should have crushed their spirits and contaminated their imaginations. The international reputation of medieval European civilization was built on achievements that were produced in environments that would be considered uninhabitable by the standards of any other culture. Foreign visitors from the Islamic world, where sophisticated plumbing and waste management had been standard for centuries, were horrified by the sanitary conditions in European castles. Their written accounts describe European nobles as living like animals. Despite their pretensions to refinement and civilization, these cultural comparisons reveal that medieval Europeans weren't primitive because they lacked the knowledge to build better sanitation systems. They were primitive because they chose not to apply existing knowledge to solve obvious problems. The technical expertise for creating effective waste management already existed in other parts of the world, but European nobles were too proud or too set in their ways to learn from foreign examples. The legacy of these medieval practices extended far beyond the Middle Ages, influencing European attitudes toward cleanliness, privacy, and bodily functions for centuries afterward. The psychological adaptation mechanisms that allowed medieval people to function in waste-contaminated environments created cultural patterns that persisted long after the practical reasons for them had disappeared. European resistance to bathing, their comfort with public bodily functions, and their acceptance of unsanitary living conditions all had roots in the medieval experience of garderobe-centered life. The gradual transition away from these practices happened so slowly that each generation thought they were living in much more refined conditions than their predecessors, even when the actual improvements were minimal. People who moved from garderobe systems to slightly better waste disposal methods congratulated themselves on achieving modern sanitation, never realizing that their new systems were still primitively disgusting by any reasonable standard. The historical amnesia that erased these realities from popular memory was partly deliberate and partly unconscious. Later generations were so embarrassed by their ancestors' living conditions that they systematically avoided discussing them in historical accounts, focusing instead on military victories, political intrigues, and cultural achievements that seemed more worthy of remembrance. This selective memory created the romanticized vision of medieval life that persists in popular culture today. The archaeological evidence that remains in surviving castles tells a different story than the written records, revealing the true extent of waste-related contamination that shaped medieval life. Soil analysis around castle foundations shows layers of human waste accumulation that built up over centuries, creating contaminated zones that are still detectable today. The bacterial signatures in these archaeological deposits provide scientific proof of living conditions that medieval chroniclers were too polite to describe accurately. The architectural modifications made to existing castles over time reveal the gradual recognition that waste disposal was a serious problem requiring engineering solutions. Later additions to medieval fortifications often included improved garderobe systems, better ventilation, and attempts to redirect waste away from main living areas. But these improvements were usually minor modifications to fundamentally flawed systems, rather than comprehensive redesigns based on better understanding of sanitation principles. The social implications of living in these conditions extended beyond individual discomfort to shape the fundamental character of medieval civilization. People who spent their entire lives surrounded by human waste developed different concepts of personal dignity, social hierarchy, and appropriate behavior than people who lived in cleaner environments. The medieval acceptance of suffering, their comfort with hierarchical social systems, and their resignation to unchangeable circumstances all reflected psychological adaptations to living conditions that would drive modern people to revolution or madness. The economic costs of these sanitation practices, when calculated across entire kingdoms and centuries, represent one of the greatest wastes of human resources in history. The shortened lifespans, reduced productivity, and constant medical expenses caused by waste-related diseases consumed enormous amounts of wealth and human potential. The military effectiveness of medieval armies was significantly reduced by the chronic health problems that plagued soldiers who had grown up in contaminated castle environments. The technological stagnation that characterized medieval waste management reflected broader cultural attitudes that prioritized tradition over innovation and social status over practical improvement. The same societies that produced remarkable advances in metallurgy, architecture, and mechanical engineering remained stubbornly committed to waste disposal methods that hadn't changed significantly since the fall of Rome. This selective resistance to progress reveals how cultural values can override obvious practical necessities. The international health consequences of these practices created disease patterns that shaped the demographic history of medieval Europe. The constant circulation of waste-related pathogens between castles, cities, and trade routes created endemic health problems that reduced population growth, shortened average lifespans, and made European populations particularly vulnerable to epidemic diseases. The Black Death and other major plagues found fertile ground in populations already weakened by chronic exposure to waste-related infections. The psychological trauma inflicted on children who grew up in these environments has never been adequately studied or acknowledged by historians. Young people who learned to accept the constant presence of human waste as normal developed fundamentally different relationships with their own bodies, their physical environment, and their expectations for basic comfort and dignity. These psychological patterns were then transmitted to subsequent generations, creating cultural continuities that persisted long after the original conditions had changed. The servant populations who maintained these systems bore the greatest burden of waste-related health problems, while receiving the least recognition or compensation for their essential services. The life expectancy of garderobe cleaners and waste removal workers was significantly shorter than other occupations, but their deaths were rarely recorded in official documents or mourned by the communities they served. Their sacrifice made possible the lifestyle of medieval nobility, but their contributions were systematically erased from historical memory. The environmental damage caused by centuries of primitive waste disposal created contamination problems that persisted for generations after better sanitation systems were finally adopted. Groundwater pollution, soil contamination, and ecosystem disruption around medieval population centers required decades or centuries to recover naturally. Some areas that were heavily contaminated by medieval waste disposal remained agriculturally unproductive or unsuitable for human habitation well into the modern era. The cultural mythology that romanticizes medieval life as a time of chivalry, honor, and romantic idealism becomes almost obscene when contrasted with the reality of daily existence in waste-contaminated castles. The gap between myth and reality reveals how successfully later generations managed to forget or deny the most basic facts about their ancestors' living conditions. This historical amnesia allowed the development of cultural narratives that celebrated medieval achievements while ignoring the human cost that made those achievements possible. Looking back across the centuries at these forgotten truths about medieval bathroom practices, we're forced to confront uncomfortable questions about human adaptability, cultural values, and the relationship between civilization and basic sanitation. The people who lived through these conditions weren't inherently different from us. They were human beings with the same fundamental needs for dignity, comfort, and health that we experience today. Yet they created and maintained social systems that violated these basic needs so systematically that their living conditions resembled a form of collective insanity. Their ability to convince themselves that their waste soaked existence represented the height of civilization reveals the power of cultural conditioning to override even the most obvious evidence of the senses. The medieval nobles who sat on their wooden seats, breathing the stench of centuries old waste accumulation, truly believed they were living at the pinnacle of human achievement. They looked down on merchants, craftsmen, and peasants as inferior beings, never recognizing that these supposedly lower-class people often enjoyed better sanitation than the inhabitants of the greatest palaces in Europe. This story of medieval bathroom practices isn't just a tale of historical curiosity. It's a mirror that reflects our own capacity for self-deception and our ability to normalize conditions that future generations will find incomprehensible. The next time you flip a switch and clean water flows instantly from a tap, or you sit in privacy on a toilet that whisks waste away to treatment facilities you'll never see, remember the medieval nobles who spent their entire lives convinced that dropping their excrement out of holes in castle walls represented the height of sophisticated living. Their delusion was complete, their suffering was real, and their legacy reminds us that progress is never inevitable. It requires people willing to acknowledge uncomfortable truths and work towards solutions that serve human dignity rather than social status. In the end, the most disgusting truth about how medieval nobles went to the bathroom isn't what they did. It's that they were so convinced of their own superiority that they never imagined anything better was possible.